BC Premier Christy Clark loves to espouse the virtues of our now 9-year-old carbon tax. Terms like world-class and revenue neutral are thrown around without being qualified or quantified. And as the federal government pushes forward with its implementation of a national tax, and when the Alberta NDP implemented their own, we heard a lot about how carbon taxes can be revenue neutral. While Conservatives were always skeptical of this claim, understanding that it is a consumption tax, and consumption taxes always get passed down to you and I, the consumer. Fortunately, the Fraser Institute also wanted to investigate and quantify the BC Liberals' claims that our carbon tax is revenue neutral. They just released their report last week, and it finds that while the BC carbon tax was revenue neutral when it was first introduced, that since its price was raised from $10 to $30 a ton, there have not been further tax cuts elsewhere to offset this increase. I caught up with the report author, Charles Lammam, the Director of Fiscal Studies at the Fraser Institute, to discuss his findings further.
Back in 2008, when the BC government introduced the carbon tax, they promised that they're going to ensure that any new revenues brought in by the tax would be offset by new tax reductions. And in fact, that was the case when the tax was brought in. But 5 years later, things have changed, and today we have a situation where the carbon tax is bringing in more revenue than the new tax reductions that the BC government has implemented. In fact, over the last 2 years, British Columbians have paid almost $400 million in extra taxes as a result of this, and potentially up to $900 million over the course of 6 years.
Wow. So originally there were tax reductions to the lowest two income tax brackets and a corporate tax reduction, as well as some low income redistribution, basically checks that were cut to people in BC. I remember getting one in 2008 when I was just a student. What can the government do to make up that gap right now? We've heard Christy Clark hint that she may be looking at another round of tax cuts, but also keeping in mind that eventually we're going to have to raise that tax a little bit as the federal tax comes in by 2018 to $40 and $50 a ton. What are the solutions?
Well, I think the government needs to obviously make good on its promise of maintaining a revenue-neutral carbon tax first and foremost, and it needs to be looking at not just any kind of tax reductions, but the kind of tax reductions that are actually going to improve BC's economy. So further reductions to personal income tax rates, as well as a reduction to the corporate income tax rate. Those are the kind of tax reductions that will help set the foundation for future growth in BC, as opposed to what the government has increasingly relied on, which is these targeted tax credits for particular groups, particular industries, particular individuals. That's not the kind of tax measures that will actually foster growth in the future. So we need to get back to the things that work, and that's personal and corporate tax rate reductions.
Are you concerned that there might not be a fairness in the way we do our carbon pricing here in the West with the price per ton compared to a cap and trade system that they're putting in Ontario and Quebec? Do you think that could hurt Western Canada even further?
Well, certainly there's a divide between the theoretical ideas behind carbon pricing and what happens in practice. So in theory, a carbon tax is the more efficient way to pursue carbon pricing relative to cap and trade. But as we're seeing in the BC case, a model that has received praise globally as being the kind of gold standard to follow, it's not actually delivering on what the theoretical ideas are, which is to maintain revenue neutrality, among other things. You know, if you truly want an efficient carbon tax, you have to offset the new tax and reduce existing regulations, so that you're not imposing a tax on top of existing regulations that are intended to curb greenhouse gas emissions. That never happened to BC, but they did try to insert some type of ideal with the revenue neutrality, but even then, we've seen that unravel over the years.
So this week, the BC government will unveil their final budget before the May election. And while the Premier has hinted at more tax cuts coming, it's no longer just something she can do to win votes. It's something she must do. Premier Clark and the BC Liberals must live up to their promise that the BC carbon tax is revenue neutral by giving British Columbians and British Columbian corporations significant reductions in their tax rates, not only to offset the burden of the carbon tax today and as it rises with the federal price, but to also ensure BC stays the most competitive tax jurisdiction in Canada and doesn't lose any further ground to the US under Trump either. If Clark cannot follow through on that, she must axe the carbon tax. For TheRebel.media, I'm Christopher Wilson. We've got an election in May, so click subscribe on that YouTube channel so you never miss an update as we decide on BC's future.